Um, Good afternoon. So I'm here to speak on a project with the title Trajectories of Infrastructure Financing and Macroeconomic Policies in Practice. It's obvious that the UK's infrastructure needs investment. We have daily news stories on leaks from water pipes, dumps of wastewater on beaches, the NHS at breaking point, apart from the massive needs for the urgent decarbonisation of the economy. The UK's infrastructure stock as a share of GDP also lags behind its European peers. It's smaller than the stock of Italy as a share of GDP, France and the Netherlands. Now the political class has obviously woken up to these realities and infrastructure is all the rage. Yet it's unclear how additional investment in infrastructure in the UK will be financed. The private finance initiatives of PFI and PF2 have been abandoned by the government, and post-Brexit Britain will no longer have access to the infrastructure funds that were being provided through the European Investment Bank. At the same time, there is massive contestation from the opposition benches with regard to the consensus that had come to prevail in the last 2 to 3 decades, which put private finance at the heart of infrastructure in the UK. Further, the fiscal rules around debt and public spending may end up on the scrap heap. So all this creates a policy gap. The government is uncertain on how to proceed, and indeed we are currently awaiting the results of a consultation by the government launched earlier this year on, and I quote, how best to support private investment in infrastructure, unquote. So our research seeks to contribute to filling this gap by going beyond traditional macro approaches to infrastructure. Now, macroeconomics traditionally tends to understand the impact of infrastructure mainly in terms of effects on output, employment and productivity. However, the origins of investment finance and associated financial flows also have significant, if little understood, macroeconomic implications. The project, if you want, takes its cue from Ronald Coase, who chastised his fellow economists like Mill, Samuelson, Pigou, when they advanced theories on how infrastructure should be financed and managed. And he chastised his fellow economists for their failure to engage with specifics before developing a general theory. And I want to take this lengthy quote from Coase to drive this point home. So here is a long quote from Coase from an article in 1974, and he stated, I think we should try to develop generalizations which could give us guidance as to how various activities should best be organized and financed, but such generalizations are not likely to be helpful unless they are derived from studies of how such activities are actually carried out within different institutional frameworks. Such studies would enable us to discover which factors are important and which are not in determining the outcome, and would lead to generalizations which have a solid case. They are also likely to serve another purpose by showing us the richness of the social alternatives between which we can choose, unquote. So we take up Coase's challenge of developing general theory from specifics by proposing an interdisciplinary empirical approach to exploring the emerging cultures of expertise in infrastructure and their effects. So our work examines the assumptions of these cultures of expertise, who puts them forward, why, and what their implications might be. So the project offers a way to assess, if you want, the institutional basis of macroeconomic policy making around infrastructure, and seeks to put forward suggestions on whether and how this should be changed and what other evidence-based policy ideas and or segments of society should be involved in decision-making around infrastructure. So the main questions animating the project are: what cultures of expertise prevail as the policy landscape around infrastructure financing in the UK is being reshaped, and what are the implications of these cultures for infrastructure outcomes? Now, in the context of the Rebuilding Macro Network, we hope that the research will generate insights across macroeconomic theory and policy, a closer look at how a particular domain of state intervention takes shape and its effects, we believe can reveal broader lessons about macro policy interventions beyond infrastructure. So if you want, infrastructure financing will serve as an index or a worked example of how to understand macroeconomic policy more broadly. And this is important as we think that traditional macroeconomics does not take into account significant factors that affect the design and the outcomes of economic policies as they are practiced. We think that it doesn't take into account the structural, the systemic, the historical, and the cultural. These features, however, are core to making sense of macroeconomic policy outcomes. So we propose this interdisciplinary approach as an alternative, and we hope that with that approach, we are seeking to put essential, real-world features of contemporary capitalism at the core of our investigation. Now, the project started recently in May 2019, and we are a team of 3. I'm working together with Kate Bayliss from SOAS and with Benjamin Bowles, equally from SOAS. Now, how will I proceed in the rest of the presentation? I briefly want to outline the main policy issues that motivate the research, some of the research questions, say a few things regarding why we opted for an interdisciplinary approach and what analytical framework we will use to organize the outcomes of this approach. Then indicate the specific methods we are using to operationalize that approach, and wrap up with a few preliminary observations. So first, the issues. Private finance in the UK, what has happened? Most of you will be aware that the UK has been at the forefront of the promotion of private finance in infrastructure, and this has translated into one of the largest shares of private finance in infrastructure across the OECD, and in strong involvement of the UK in the promotion of the model of private finance in infrastructure globally. So this graph just gives you the holdings of infrastructure stocks in the UK over a decade, and it shows you that they are equally held between the private and the public sectors. Private finance is involved in infrastructure in the UK in different ways depending on the sectors. So we have the PFI, PF2 model, which has been used in social infrastructure mainly, where the private sector provides upfront funds, and this is repaid over decades through availability payments by the government. There is the model of what is called the regulated asset-based model, mainly used in water and energy distribution. And this assures investors of their returns on an asset base through a system of periodic price reviews or controls. And then there is the system of the contracts for differences, mainly used in renewable energy, which also effectively guarantees the price that investors will receive for their investment in renewable energy for a length of time, let's say 15-year period. These commitments are ultimately met by consumers via payment of bills. So these financing mechanisms reflect different ways by which the private sector is offered secure returns on investment. Now, you're probably all aware that the PFI model has come unstuck in the wake of the global financial crisis, and this again shows you the number of projects and their capital value of PFI over the last 2 decades. Now, this is despite attempts by the government in 2012 to save the PFI model through the introduction of PF2. Finally, the government formally abandons the model in autumn last year. However, there has also been dissatisfaction with other traditional instruments to involve private finance in infrastructure, whether this is the regulated asset-based model or contracts for differences. And this dissatisfaction stretches across different constituencies. So, consumer and citizen protection groups have been dissatisfied, and that's mainly because of the prices that people have to pay for access to water or energy. The regulators have been dissatisfied because they're putting questions there as whether the models are delivering the investment that is necessary, at what price, etc. And parts of government are being dissatisfied, and we know, for instance, that there is a current ongoing review of the contracts for different scheme by BASE. Finally, the investors are dissatisfied because they are complaining about a compression of their returns. Talking to some of the stakeholders, it seems very much that everything is up for grabs for the moment. And this is quite nicely reflected in this quote from a respondent linked to the investor community, who put this to us in quite exasperated manner, and I will quote from the interview. What is the success of the RAB model? Because it worked previously and investors liked it previously and it seemed to work really well for the consumers, but at the moment the regulators don't like it, the government seems not to like it, at least in some quarters. And on top of that, the CFD model is currently being reviewed by the Base Select Committee. So the government basically said, we used to have 3 tools to finance infrastructure. We used to have PFI, not anymore. We've got RAB, we think it's great, but we are going to trash it, unquote of the interview. So you get the sense everything seems very much up for grabs. However, the government remains very strongly committed to the role of private finance in investment in infrastructure. And this is evident in the latest iteration of the infrastructure pipeline that projects investments of 600 billion over the next 10 years, and where the government has indicated that it wishes to see half of that to be financed and built by the private sector. The obvious question then is, what will be the governance and financing forms for this substantial involvement of the private sector in infrastructure, and what will be the implications of promoting particular forms over other? So PFI has been abandoned. What to do? Should there be more use of the RAB model? Should there be more use of CFD projects, etc.? And so, in March 2019, the government announced a review of infrastructure financing, seeking views on how to move forward with private finance in infrastructure. So the explicit purpose of the consultation is to collect views on, and I quote, the future role of the government in ensuring that viable projects can raise the private finance they need. However, at the same time of these government attempts to redefine the nature of a continued role for private finance in infrastructure, we see increasingly organized and widespread demands for alternatives, probably most emblematically in the Labour Party manifesto of 2017. So, as the government launched its consultation on how to continue to involve private sector in infrastructure, the Shadow Chancellor launches his own consultation on democratic public ownership, with very different questions being put out for consultation. So, policy around infrastructure financing is obviously in a state of flux, but the government remains very strongly committed to the substantial involvement of the private sector in infrastructure financing and delivery. That then raises this question of why such a strong commitment to private finance. And we've noticed that there is an underlying assumption that the implications of infrastructure provision are invariant to the way that infrastructure is being financed. And this tends to be complemented by a number of reasons why private finance is preferred. So, of course, it appears to keep the fiscal deficit down. Second, there is an inherent ideology that considers the private sector to be more efficient, and this is despite lack of theoretical and empirical support to this claim. Now, it's indeed telling that the National Infrastructure Commission only in July 2019 proposed an analytical framework to be used by public bodies to analyze the costs and benefits of different financing and procurement models, including private financing versus traditional procurement. There is path dependency. Private investment has become the norm, and there is, of course, a wealth of private finance, including of pension funds, that is looking for assets and lobbying for investment opportunities. However, at the same time, there is extensive criticism of the use of private finance in infrastructure. These contracts can be at high cost to end users and taxpayers. They can be regressive, maybe funding dividends to offshore shareholders from the pockets of households meeting their basic needs, and they can promote fragmentation of infrastructure. Transforming infrastructure into an asset class often necessitates its unbundling into separate activities and discrete assets that can generate some form of return. There can also be a bias towards large projects to suit private finance. So there is all these tensions that are coalescing around infrastructure finance, which then gives rise to our research questions. Who is determining the future for infrastructure finance and how? What are the implications of who is prevailing in how the infrastructure policy landscape is being redefined, and what should be done differently? Now, how are we proceeding? We are doing this as an interdisciplinary research endeavor. Our project examines macroeconomic relations, policy, and outcomes of infrastructure financing and provision on the basis of interdisciplinary encounters across social anthropology, economics, and political economy. This should allow us to engage with the systemic, material, and technological realities within which macroeconomic outcomes come about, as well as the cultures and regimes of knowledge that hold sway as these take form. Traditional economic understandings of infrastructure in terms of, for instance, expenditure-related categories like aggregate demand, or multipliers, or market failures, do not give appropriate attention to the particular financial, political, and economic realities within which infrastructure policy and practices take form. These realities, nevertheless, have important implications for the way in which infrastructure policy proceeds, is delivered, and has effects. More specifically, economic approaches to infrastructure tend to bypass core questions such as what is infrastructure, for whom is it, and whether particular infrastructure governance mechanisms and norms have implications for outcomes of infrastructure intervention. At the same time, the infrastructural turn in anthropology has begun to bring cultural uses and understandings of infrastructure to the fore, often charting the interplay of the technological and the human in great detail. So our aim is to produce new insights via interdisciplinary engagement on this particular research terrain. So the aim is to go beyond merely drawing on insights generated separately to move towards joint production of new knowledge for this particular topic. So for the purpose of these interdisciplinary research projects, we are combining anthropological conceptualizations of infrastructure, and I'm going to quote again, as science through which politics is translated from a rationality to a practice in all its social, material, and political complexity. We will combine such notions with a political economy analysis that draws attention to specific economic and financial realities. So in our approach, infrastructure policy and practices are not just a matter of how much, infrastructure's quantitative dimension as an additional source of demand, creating employment and output, but also of what, infrastructure linked to productivity and growth, and crucially, of how, capturing the processes of financing and delivering infrastructure. Decision-making regarding infrastructure and its financing inevitably promotes some interest over others. Now, to help us organize and analyze the insights we gain from our interdisciplinary encounters, we will use what has been called the system of provision approach as a heuristic device. Now, this approach was originally devised by Ben Fine in the early 1990s as a way of investigating consumption. Now, the essence of the approach is that consumption outcomes are, one, linked to the systems by which a good or a service is provided. Two, they are affected by the material properties of what is being provided. And three, they are affected by the location or context in which they are provided. So in contrast to mainstream economics, the focus of attention for this approach is not on individual preferences, but on consumption norms as the drivers of who gets what and how. Such norms result in shared social practices which emerge from the values, meanings, and practices associated with provisioning. Questions then arise as to what form such norms might take, how they become established, what their effects are, and how they might be changed. By shifting the attention to the entire chain by which a commodity is provided, the approach highlights the intersecting and potentially contested roles, agendas, and competing incentives of the agents involved in provisioning, from production through to consumption, including the state. So the supply and financing of infrastructure involves a number of agent groups. In production, there are the construction companies, the financiers, the specialist providers, the consultants, etc. There is also the state that operates as a provider or a commissioner sometimes, as a policymaker and regulator other times. And then ultimately, there are the consumers. Now, each of these agent groups is likely to have different priorities and a different perspective when it comes to infrastructure provision. The way these tensions are resolved in infrastructure policy reflects underlying power relations across these different groups. So infrastructure that we use reflects a vast number of decisions as to what should be provided, where and how, and the effects are far-reaching, and these go far beyond the infrastructure itself. So our research will connect material dimensions such as financial flows, nature of agents, institutional structures, with cultural elements such as understandings of agents, prevailing policy narratives, and mainstream disciplinary and policy cultures. This should then highlight significant determinants of infrastructure policy outcomes, which are largely neglected in traditional macroeconomic approaches. So how will we do that? We will do that by using a mixed methods approach. We combine quantitative mapping with qualitative research methods. And these qualitative research methods include close dialogue interviewing with key stakeholders across the system of provision. This includes interviews with the infrastructure policy community, including the National Infrastructure Commission, Infrastructure Project Authority, the Treasury, the investment community, various organizations representing the investors, the regulators, journalists, academics, and so forth. We're also attending industry meetings and doing very close scrutiny of policy documents. The project is organized around 3 teams, but I won't speak much to that. It's basically we're mapping who is financing what. We're examining how infrastructure is being understood, and then we are trying to match these together. Can we understand how particular mapping of infrastructure financing then translates into particular narratives around infrastructure? Finally, it's very early days and we have just started working on this, and so without wanting to preempt any final conclusions, I want just to make a few preliminary observations. And these are mainly twofold, and then a set of reasons why we are proposing this. First, infrastructure policy is being reshaped predominantly by negotiations between private finance and governmental institutions. For example, the ongoing consultation on infrastructure finance that's being carried out by the Treasury is being supported by an advisory panel that is made up almost entirely of representatives of private utilities and the private sector, and the financial sector. So there's no academics on this panel, no consumer groups, no trade unions, etc. Second, these negotiations, the subsequent contractual arrangements and their real costs and benefits are less visible to the public and institutions than ever before. And the reason why we make this, if you want preliminary conclusion or assertions, is for sets of reasons. First, we think that the abolition of PFI, PF2 by the government was a response to the decline of interest of private finance in those particular assets. Second, while private finance has stalled in social infrastructure, it has begun to flourish in other sectors such as renewable energy, but it has done so in more invisible forms. It proceeds on the basis of governance arrangements that do not depend on long-term tax-funded payments to private investors, and instead it relies on state facilitation of revenue captured by private investors. The way in which these alternative governance and finance arrangements offer what is called value for money, however, are more opaque and difficult to unpack than for traditional PFI schemes. Third, the profile of private financial involvement in these sectors is perhaps more heterogeneous to include a range of financial agents. Fourth, the trend of continued private financial involvement reflects both continued appetite of private finance for infrastructure assets and a political unwillingness to reverse privatization policy. Fifth, at the same time, however, there has been increasing dissatisfaction from within the investor community with the policy sphere, in particular with regard to the regulatory environment. And 6, this creates particular tensions in the reliance of the government on private finance for half of its infrastructure pipeline. Private investors are reticent to engage if the regulatory landscape does not sufficiently represent their interest. This raises questions, of course, of whom should the regulator be independent, of government departments, of the investors, of consumers. 7th, the government then remains caught in a bind of regulating private finance while seeking to achieve twin and conflicting objectives of meeting the needs of investors and protecting public interest. So tighter regulatory constraints, for instance, can weaken the creditworthiness of the private companies providing the particular service. And it's not clear how this will be resolved. And finally, there are strong arguments for alternatives from opposition parties, and this is adding to the tensions in the infrastructure financing landscape. So all this to say that this is a very timely project and that we need to unpack very carefully the current policy diagram to fully understand what is going on, how this landscape is being redefined, and what the implications of this will be.